Hello, this is the voice of Stewart Pearce, and welcome to Deep Dialogues, a series of vital conversations that I have with global soul stewards from all over the world who provide us with an understanding of how we can create a new hierarchy of values that is absolutely significant at this unique time of becoming. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening. And so here we are. Welcome, everybody, particularly Dr. David Hamilton, who has been on the Deep Dialogues before, but not for some considerable amount of time. So, dear sir, welcome, 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 welcome. It's always great to have you on.
Thank you for inviting me again, Stuart. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you, even if it's virtual. You know, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, well, hopefully soon.
Yeah.
By the end of this year, you know, my great intention is that this will not just be an online platform. It will be something where we sit in the studio and hunker down into a 90-minute conversation, and that will go on to all the varying live stream processes. And welcome to all of you wonderful people. I see names that I know. Stephen, Angela, Robin, Sarah. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're slightly late. Apologies. David and I haven't seen each other for many moons, and we were sharing, and then I suddenly realized, wait a minute, what time is it? So forgive us. Olivier, wonderful to see you. Corinne, wonderful. So let me just introduce who David is for those of you who are unfamiliar. I'm sure you're very, very few and far between. He's a very extraordinary gentleman and one of Hay House's leading UK or European authors, and has been for some time. So, Dr. David Hamilton has a PhD in organic chemistry and worked in the pharmaceutical industry for 5 years, developing drugs for cardiovascular disease, particularly in relation to cancer cure. Inspired by the placebo effect, he left that industry to educate and illuminate people about how they can harness thoughts and emotions to better improve their health. And since that time, he has actually authored 11 books. So we will be putting up David's wonderful website detailing later. His latest, of course, is one of the reasons why I really wanted him to come onto the platform this evening with me in Deep Dialogues. It's called Why Woo Woo Works. He has written regularly for Huffington Post. He's been the kindness czar for Psychology's magazine in the UK, which I do believe is now an online platform of international standard. And David has been featured in many award-winning documentaries, particularly one called Heal, that has appeared regularly in global media, such as being featured on Channel 4's Sunday brunch program, and also on CBS. So he is a gentleman that has really trafficked himself through the Mind, Body, Spirit Symposium for some considerable amount of time, and is always an enjoyable being to be with. He's so charming, but at the same time has ravishing information. So welcome, David.
Oh, thank you. Stuart, you know, that's about the best introduction I've ever had in my life. You know, Stuart, can I tell you, that is the opposite of an introduction that just came to mind. I remember my first big conference talk in the USA. It was more than a decade ago, and it was at a big place called the Javits Center. There was 2,000 people in the audience, and I was the first speaker on after lunchtime. And I think Cheryl Richardson was speaking, Susie Orman, Greg Braden, Louise Hay actually was the first speaker. And the event director didn't know me. And so when each of the Americans got introduced, there was this massive big, like the introduction you just delivered to me. And it was like a really fantastic introduction. And by the time the person came on stage, the introduction had been bigged them up so much that by the time the person walked on stage, they were receiving a standing ovation. You know, this is 5 times on Oprah and million copy bestseller, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it got to me, and I was the first speaker after lunch, and I was so nervous because I'd never spoken, A, in the USA in front of a big conference, and secondly, to such a big audience, and I was feeling quite nervous, and Louise Hay, bless her, had held my hand and said, I wanted you to speak here because I believe you have something very important to say. And it's one of my strongest memories of Louise. She saw I was nervous and she just took my hand. It was just such a lovely thing. And I was beginning to feel a bit more relaxed and thinking, well, you get great introductions here. And remembering the big introductions and the standing ovations that everyone else got before they spoke. So the event director came on and she started to say, welcome back from lunch. And she started and she said, and our next speaker is Dr. David Hamilton from across the pond. That was my introduction.
That was your introduction.
That was it, the entirety of it. And all you heard echoing through this auditorium, half the size of a football stadium, 2,000 people, was,
oh dear.
Echoing, because people couldn't quite work out, is that the whole introduction? Look, is that it? And she must have got a mind blank because she didn't know me and probably just forgot everything. So in my sudden panic that I'm not getting the same introduction everyone else came, I walked onto stage and fell. Walked onto the stage. And then people started laughing. And I thought, the thought into my mind, I bet they think I'm the comedy act and I'll do like 5 minutes of stand-up and then the actual speaker comes on. It was the strangest moment. So that popped into my mind because your beautiful introduction was the best I've ever had. And it's the exact opposite of that one I got in the Javits Center in New York.
Well, bless you. That was terrible. How long ago was that?
From memory now, I think that was 2009. I think it was my first big Hay House USA. It wasn't an I Can Do It. It was a You Can Heal Your Life conference. It was a series of 4, I think, conferences that Louise Hay had set up. And I was speaking at the New York one. That was it.
There's a theatrical parlance which says you died. And it's happened to me. I've been presenting for many, many years, as you know, and it's happened to me on 2 occasions. And one of them was giving a TED talk just at the beginning of COVID. And of course, I hadn't anticipated that I would walk out onto the platform and not see anybody's faces. They were all wearing hats and masks. All I saw were their eyes, and their eyes were dead. And it was stupid. I should have been prepared, and I completely froze. And anyway, I don't think it was my best presentation. But I'm a great believer in grace. And I believe if I bolster the whole of your professional status and your beingness with grace, that I'm going to get the best out of you as an interlocutor.
Well, thank you so much, Stewart.
So, bless you. Thank you for the recommendation. If you need any voiceovers, I have a voice that is in need of employment at the moment. Things are very quiet. But anyway, I'm fascinated by the whole substance of woo-woo, why woo-woo works. Please do give us a synthesis of what your thesis is about.
Well, I basically took a number of subjects that I sometimes feel are unfairly treated in academia and the mainstream, and also stuff that I had a wee bit of experience of some of them. And I just delved into the scientific and medical journals, and I brought out of them a heap of supporting evidence to show that, some of these things that we dismiss, and I say we dismiss as woo-woo in a derogatory sense, we're not dismissing them because people who dismiss these subjects are not really doing it from a position of knowledge and expertise. Like people who dismiss, say, Reiki, for example, as woo-woo, are not doing it because they're experts in the field and they actually know whether X, Y, or Z is true or not. But most of the time, it's because they're not experts. And we just make an assumption. And I don't mean that unkindly because, I've got friends who've dismissed these things and they're good people. It's not people, most times people are not doing it unkindly. It's just a habit that we get into of dismissing, Reiki, that's a lot of woo-woo, and, crystal's a lot of woo-woo, Psi, prayer, all that. It's a lot of nonsense kind of thing. And it's not that we're informed. So I thought, well, I would like to inform people. So I pulled out of the scientific and medical journals as much supporting evidence as I could for a number of subjects that I personally felt were unfairly treated. And there's not a lot of people who practice these arts and who have achieved a lot of results, and people have benefited from these things. And I thought, well, I think sometimes they're unfairly treated, so I would like to really demonstrate there is a lot of supporting evidence. So here it is, kind of thing. So that's really the premise of the book.
That's wonderful, because the prevailing thesis always was, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was a cerebral statement that was made, but it was actually packed up with a tremendous amount of prejudice and absurdity, which was all to do with the old paradigm measurings of justice, of judgment rather, and coercion and manipulation and control. So I think it's absolutely amazing. And I know before we came onto air, we were talking about the derivation of the word woo-woo. And, I just thought it might be interesting for our correspondents listening. Hello, everybody. Myra, Javier, Janet, wonderful. Yolanda, it's gorgeous to see all these wonderful people. And Dawn, I can only see a small fraction of the chat box. David, by the way, if you look to the right of your screen, you'll see private chat and comments. And if you click on comments, you'll be able to see the chat box.
Oh, wow. Oh, do you know, I'd moved my screen to the side because it made it look like I was looking to the side. So I put your face right in the center, which took the chat function away. Oh, that's lovely. Oh, hello, everyone. Thanks for your lovely comments.
So
really
I've got, over the last 2 years, because I run so many workshops and retreats online, I've got used to having a conversation with the chat box as opposed to seeing people's faces. But I will, of course, ask people questions when we get into it. So the substance of woo-woo, the derivation of woo-woo.
Yeah, well, it's generally, if I can give you the Oxford dictionary definition. It's I believe it's unconventional beliefs regarded as having little or no scientific basis, especially those related to spirituality, mysticism, and alternative medicine. And in fact, the word woo-woo, the term woo-woo, was actually coined in the early 80s, and it was a derogatory term, really as an imitation of the wailing sounds supposedly made by ghosts. Remember those old black and white films? Even the comedy ones, Laurel and Hardy, when you had the ghost and it was a person wearing a white sheet and they went woo. So in the early 80s, someone somewhere coined the term woo-woo as a put down for anything spirituality, mysticism, alternative medicine. And it's unfair. And so what I decided to do was rebrand that actual term and turn it into something positive. Because I did something similar. With one of my books on kindness. For example, I wrote a book called The 5 Side Effects of Kindness, because having worked in the pharmaceutical industry in my previous career, a side effect is always the negative term. It's a negative side effect of a drug, but a side effect really is anything that happens alongside what you're trying to accomplish. So when you be kind, it turns out that there are side effects of that, which includes a benefit to your mental health, improvement in your cardiovascular function, improvement in immune function, all these kind of things. So I thought I'd rebrand the term woo-woo from the derogatory into, let's embrace it. Let's embrace the woo. In fact, it's not really woo-woo. In fact, most of the stuff is true woo. I actually say it's not woo-woo, it's true woo. Most of the stuff that I'm talking about actually has a strong scientific basis that just we don't realize is there.
Yeah. And it's interesting that the word woo is never seen as a pejorative. It's always seen as a positive.
Yeah.
Of course, in meaning to invoke love through.
Yeah, to woo someone, to woo them before marriage type thing. Yeah.
Because I can remember hearing the term woo-woo as a child. So we're going all the way back to the 50s, I remember. And of course, there is also to woo, which is what owls do,
yeah.
and of course, I don't think any of us would cast owls into a negative connotation, but they are, of course, in the animal medicine kingdom, they are considered to be the birds of wisdom. So it's interesting that that prejudice from a social point of view brings the whole substance of woo-woo into a negative context. And so thank you so much for evoking it so that people can really consider. It's used a tremendous amount in the United States, woo-woo. Anyway, So, and so the book, what's the most salacious feature about the book? When I say that, it's not really using the word properly, because it really is associated with sexuality as salaciousness. But, you know, what's the juiciest part of the book for you? The bit that really stimulated you?
Do you know that there's so much, Stuart? I think there was 2 or 3 chapters in particular when I was working on them, I was blown away. The first one was, you know, a few actually. The first thing that really struck me was the wealth of scientific information linking things like trauma with in childhood with disease and pain in adulthood. The next chapter that really surprised me was the wealth of data showing that nature in and of itself heals. I mean, for example, did you know that hospital patients tend to recover faster physically and mentally if they have a window that looks onto nature compared with an identical room with a window that looks onto another hospital building? You know, but I think that the chapter that probably most surprised me, the longest chapter actually, was a chapter on crystals. That, you know, how much there was to say scientifically about crystals. You know, not that there's any randomized controlled trials, but you don't always need to have a randomized controlled trial. You can explain why something might be by invoking other areas of science. You know, I mean, a physicist, it doesn't run a randomized controlled trial, so you don't always have, you know, it was one of the points I made, you don't always have to have such and such a thing. So it was surprising to me to find so much basis that could explain some of the ways, perhaps, you know, for example, that holding a clear crystal could be a support to meditation. It's why it's been used for thousands of years in Dzogchen, that transmission, that teaching in Buddhism, because the clarity of a crystal serves as what's called a mental representation of a clear state of mind and being. And so it becomes a symbol, something, you know, to aim towards, for example. So I explained some of the aspects by invoking other features in other areas of science. You know, another area I'd say that maybe didn't surprise me, but I was intrigued by the insights that I found myself about answering the question, is consciousness inside your head and produced by neurons in the brain, or is your head inside consciousness? And that the universe itself is a projection of consciousness. And so I really dived into that subject to the point where I even wrote down a little mathematical equation that might predict how the outcome of interactions between people, even if you say a prayer for someone and stuff, you know, and I think that surprised me, that there was something there to be said about that when I got to that part of the book as well.
And so, okay, so we have crystals. What other aspects of the dynamic process of contemporary spirituality and the healing techniques that have exuded out of the force that really gathered during the late 70s and through the 80s, 90s, and now, you know, 40 years later, we have an extraordinary industry, which is one of the largest growth industries on our planet. What other aspects, what modalities do you move into?
Well, you know, one of the things I hear that here's another thing that I stumbled across and made a big deal of actually in the towards the end of the book, is there's a lot of studies, a lot of research that shows that prayer works. So researchers call it intercessory prayer. So you say a prayer and then you say another, you know, consistently for a person. But there's also a lot of studies that say that there's no evidence of prayer, to the point that one of the big reputable reviewers, the Cochrane Review, they did a review and they kind of sat on the fence and they said, well, there is data showing the effectiveness of prayer, there's also data showing not. So they said, we will conclude that there is not enough evidence, sort of a thing. So I dived into a lot of the studies that supported prayer. And I found a lot of the studies that negated it and said, look, it doesn't work. And what astonished me was subtle difference, but a really key difference in the protocol. In a lot of the studies where prayer was shown to be successful, part of the protocol allowed for empathy, emotional connection. I'll give you an example. So one of the most celebrated ones was published in the Southern Medical Journal by an MD called Randolph Bird. And he got volunteers to say prayers for, a few hundred cardiovascular patients who'd undergone, heart surgery. Half of them were prayed for and half of them weren't. But the people who were doing the praying, they were given the name of each person that they would offer a prayer for. They were also told a little bit about the person, a bit of the background, a wee bit about this is what they're suffering with right now. But also, and here's another important thing, they were given regular updates regarding the person's condition. Now, think about what that does. People who've practiced the healing arts, what does that do? You develop an empathy for them and an emotional investment in that person's recovery. Like, I really want you to recover. I really care for you. And you start to feel it. And here's the key. Felt connection as you generate. Now, in many of the successful prayer studies, something like that is in the protocol. But you look at almost all of the studies where prayer was shown to be not effective, and they were done much more clinically. Typically, what you get is instead of getting the person's name, you might just get their first name and the first initial of their surname and a study ID number or some other number that represents, it's like a prison uniform. Here's the person's number and ID, but there's nothing about the person. There's no opportunity to build this felt connection. And all of these studies tend to fail. And so what I pointed out with the supporting evidence from a lot of the research on psi, which already, psi being the umbrella term for, ESP, distant healing, telepathy, all that kind of stuff. Researchers who've been studying this a long time have long since understood the importance of felt connection, emotional connection. So using their data also to back this up, I pointed out that the reason why these studies in prayer succeeded, the ones that did succeed, is because they allowed felt connection. The reason why the others failed is because they didn't. And it wasn't that the researchers were bad people and set out to say, I'm going to prove that prayer is a lot of rubbish. It wasn't. A lot of them are genuine scientists, just curious. It just didn't occur to them to build that into the protocol, because why would it occur to you? Because, to an academic, a prayer is just something you petition God or another deity to intervene on someone's behalf. So empathy, it doesn't matter. All you really surely are doing is giving the person, God, a name and an address. That's all they need, surely. So we start to do these studies too clinically. And in doing them too clinically, we take out the important factor, which is emotional connection. So when I dived into that subject, I realized that the studies that show if you separate two people by a distance, put one of them inside an MRI scanner, take the other down the corridor, or even not even MRI, but even EEG. And if you stimulate one person by showing them visual stimulus, then what you will find is the brain of the other person will react to that. It will be correlated with that. But here's the key. If and only if those people have a felt empathetic connection, or perhaps if in some studies they shared some meditative time beforehand where they were instructed to, I wish the researchers would say, look into each other's eyes and meditate together, but also try to feel a sense of connection with each other. Shortly, we will move you to another room, but when we move you to the other rooms, I would like you to try to maintain a feeling of connection with the partner. When they do that, what you find is when one's in the MRI scanner or the EEG helmet thing on, and the other is stimulated, you almost always see a correlation, but it's absent in images of these studies that are done without that felt connection in the protocol. So I argued in the chapters on prayer that this is the key, actually, more than intention, more than having, this is what I want to do, is a sense of connection, a bond, a felt connection is almost the secret ingredient to get all sorts of distant intentionality effects. So I pointed out that that is something very, very important. And I argued in the second half, towards the end of the book, that if we built these things into all similar protocols, we would start to see some really compelling evidence for the seeming woo-woo.
It's a fascinating construct because, again, it gives illustration or illumination in relation to the substance of how disconnected we are between thought and feeling, and therefore how disembodied we are, that we're placing everything into this terminal of our bodies, doing, thinking, and this hovering between left and right hemisphere, shall I, shan't I, will I, won't I? And as soon as we move into the heart, as soon as we move into the body, as soon as we move into the very center of who we are, and we start to engender, as you were saying, the emotional resonance of empathy and compassion and, dare I say, love, that automatically there are secretions endocrinologically that affect our neurology and bring about a huge change in the electromagnetic energy of our field. I mean, presumably, you know, what's coming to my mind very specifically here is that essential belief that's propagated by heart math, that the heart has an energy field 5,000 times greater than the brain. Is that something you subscribe to?
It's something I wrote about actually in the book, because I wrote about it in the context of offering an explanation as to why biofuel therapies work. You know, because I put a lot of evidence for the therapy Reiki in the book for two reasons. One, that Reiki is one of the most criticized of all the call them biofield therapies. I'll explain that in a second. But secondly, it's also one of the ones that's been most researched in science. There's randomized controlled trials showing that Reiki is highly effective against things like pain and even symptoms of depression and anxiety. People just don't realize that in the general public, that there is actually supporting evidence. You know, and let me qualify when I say a biofuel therapy. That's a technical term used in science and academia. Now, a biofield it's an electric or magnetic field that's generated by a biological organism. So, for example, as differentiated from a conventional electric or magnetic field, like if I, for example, plug my iPhone into the wall socket to charge it, then I'm tapping into an electric field from the circuit. So the electrons flying through the wire, that's generating. I get so excited. That generates an electric field. So that we just call that electricity. But if the electric or magnetic field is generated not from a wall socket, but from a biological organism or a biological process, for example, the diffusion of sodium or potassium ions in and out of cell membranes, then to make a distinction, it's called the biofield. And it sounds like a woo-woo term, but it's not. It's an academic term. It's just to define where the electric or magnetic field is generated by. And I wanted to qualify that really, really early on, because a lot of people are skeptical when they hear the term biofield. Like, I say that because one of my friends rolled his eyes when I said, I'm writing a chapter about biofield, and he rolled the eyes. A good friend. It wasn't mean unkindly, but just another thing that David's into kind of stuff. And I had to explain to him the difference between a wall socket electric field and a biological thing. So anyway, if you all electric fields generate magnetic fields. So, you know, here's something out of curiosity. I'm a great lover of learning. So I'm 5 years into a part-time university degree in mathematics and physics. So I have to formally study the mathematics of quantum mechanics, electromagnetism. I love it. You know, I absolutely love learning and studying and stuff like that. So, you know, one of the things I've had to formally study, and I could give you the mathematical equations if you want, is when you generate and send electricity, you know, round in a circle, then you generate a magnetic field at right angles to it. So the reason why, if you go online, you see images of the heart's magnetic field coming out the way is because blood is circulating around the way. Blood is going round the way in a circle. So if blood is going round that way, then the magnetic field can only come that way. The reason why you see it like that as a torus is because there's a wee rule thing saying if one thing goes that way, the other thing goes at right angles to it. And so so the heart has a magnetic field, and I say that again because even when I pointed at one time online, and somebody skeptical demanded to know what is the evidence for the heart having a magnetic field. Well, of course it has a magnetic field. You can measure it with a squid-based magnetometer, but it's one of the things that we naturally sound skeptical about because it doesn't sound plausible to us. But so the heart generates a magnetic field by virtue of the fact there is blood flow and there is movement of ions round about the body. So it has to generate a magnetic field because there's more blood going in and out of the heart than any other organ in the body, which is why it has the largest magnetic field. So when coming back to the heart math, what heart math have done is one of the things they've done is they demonstrated that the range of the magnetic field, they couch it in terms like coherence, is related to a person's emotional state. And again, there's a reason for that, because if a person is feeling stressed, then there is stress hormones being produced which alter blood flow in certain places. And if a person feels joy or empathy or compassion, then there's a change in blood flow. There's a change in a lot of biochemistry, which obviously will, if it's altering blood flow, obviously it's going to alter the heart's magnetic field. So I pointed out the heart math research that what they're trying to point out is that the heart's magnetic field is actually modulated by a person's emotional state. So in terms of one of the explanations offered for why biofuel therapies might have an effect is if the healer, and this is called the natural healer effect, if a person doing the healing, the work of a healer, is in a state of service, empathy and compassion, which I think, that's our duty. If I'm a healer, that's my duty. If someone is here.
It's the radiation of love that does
Yeah,
It's not
absolutely.
the modality. The modality is merely the external apparatus.
Absolutely.
As you say, the center, I mean, I want to give you some information about the Shante Ishtar in a moment, but I'll come to that in a second. Do carry on.
But if a person's in a state of love and empathy, feeling empathy for this person that I'm helping, who's asked for my help, if I'm, say, a Reiki practitioner, then my magnetic field for my heart will be affected by my state, and it will be clearer, more coherent, to use the terms of heart math. Now, one of the things heart math showed is to use the term coherence of their own magnetic field can impact the brain waves of a person in close proximity. It's loosely referred to as the natural healer effect. So I argued, not that science has proven that this is how Reiki works, but I offered it as potentially one of the explanations that might explain, out with the fact that research, loads and loads of pieces of research has shown evidence for Reiki. But perhaps one of the reasons why there is an effect might be this impact of the magnetic field. I can't say for absolute certain, but as a scientist myself, I would say probably there's some kind of effect from your own heart impacting on the heart or the brain of the other person. I just use the terms like magnetic field because that's where the evidence has pointed towards, I suppose.
Yeah. Have you had a conversation with Torsten Lang, the Reiki specialist?
Yeah, not for a while actually. Yeah, I've known Torsten for years actually. On and off. I've not had a conversation for a while though, but he's written some really great books on Reiki, hasn't he?
Well, his recent book is The Science of Reiki.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
Actually, he has discovered emphatically through laboratory situational conditions in Switzerland the effect on viscous matter or indeed water.
Wow.
When it's photographed before under microscopic conditions of the state of the fluid, and then after he has performed Reiki, and with particular elemental chants that arise out of the very core, the very essence of Reiki. So it'll be interesting to put you two in contact with one another. I know Torsten as a friend for a long time.
He's a lovely guy, really nice guy.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was the most difficult part of the book? What was the most challenging?
Difficult. I don't really know. Actually, as a writer, the most challenging to make simple was when I had to dive into academic philosophy, and I had to present, because what I argued for is, say in the mainstream of academia, scientists tend to believe that consciousness is produced by the brain. Either it's an illusion, it's not really real, it just seems like it's real, or it's produced by neurons in the brain. And broadly speaking, in academia, that's called materialism. And our belief in materialism isn't based on scientific evidence that materialism is true, but it's actually a metaphysical assumption. We make an assumption that it's true, and that even though we haven't found the scientific evidence yet, we probably will further down the line. But there's other contenders in philosophy for what consciousness is. In fact, David Chalmers, I talked about him in the book, wonderful academic philosopher, really great writer in ordinary prose, actually. He coined something called the hard problem of consciousness, which is, here's an example of it. So if let's say I fall and hurt my arm, then you can look at my brain and tell me, exactly what my brain is doing while I'm experiencing pain. But that's not the same as my felt experience of pain. And so the hard problem of consciousness is to do with the fact, if you're admiring a piece of art or enjoying a piece of music or even feeling love for a person, again, I could scan your brain and pinpoint exactly what your brain is doing right now. But that's a million miles away from the actual experience that you're having. Sometimes we call it the qualia problem. It's more generally referred to as the hard problem of consciousness, meaning that there's easy problems to solve in philosophy, but that's a hard problem because the materialism idea that consciousness is produced by neurons cannot account for that. But you have other philosophies that we don't really know anything about. And so when you dive into academic philosophy, trying to turn the language of academia into everyday language was a real challenge. And I drafted that chapter about 9 times or 10 times, I think, because I presented dualism, Descartes' thing, that dualism is like, grants brain matter and consciousness equal reality. So you have body and soul as 2 separate things, but neither can impinge upon the other. But then you have something called panpsychism. And panpsychism, it says that everything, all matter has experience. And it attempts to solve the hard problem by saying, right down at the heart of reality, you look inside an atom, you get protons, neutrons, electrons, croutons, and morons. No, you don't get croutons and morons, but you get protons, neutrons, and electrons. And a proton is made of quarks. So the most fundamental pieces of reality we know of are quarks, gluons, and electrons. You get 2 up quarks and a down quark that make a proton, and the quarks are held together by a field called the gluon field or gluon particles. And that's the smallest things we know. Science doesn't go any further than that. But if you were to ask me what is a quark or a gluon, then we don't know. In fact, Sir Roger Penrose wrote a big feature in New Scientist just last year. That New Scientist magazine is one of the global science magazines for educating all of us in different branches of science, but written in a magazine type format. And even Roger Penrose said, all I can tell you, if you ask me what a quark or a gluon is, all I can offer you is the mathematical equations that they satisfy. So in terms of what they are, all I can do is refer you to the mathematical equations they satisfy. So at the heart of reality, all we can say is these are what the particles do, but we don't know what they are. Now scale that up to large-scale life, and we meet the hard problem of consciousness, which is a mirror of that. We know what the brain is doing when I have an experience, but we can't account for what the experience is. So at the big scale, the macroscopic, the human scale, we know what the brain is doing when I have an experience, but I can't account for what the experience is like. Go down to the heart of reality at the quantum scale, And we know what the particles do, but we don't know what they are. So panpsychism suggests that maybe the particles have experience. And it's the combined, and I'm not suggesting like a quark or a gluon enjoys Netflix on my sofa on a Friday night, you know, but maybe a rudimentary particle in a rudimentary field has a rudimentary form of experience, tiny little bit of experience. And what panpsychists argue, it's the combination of trillions and trillions and trillions of particles of experience. So this is supported by by some mathematics, integrated information theory. It's more complexity produces consciousness. So panpsychism is suggesting that the reason why we're conscious is because we're made of consciousness at the heart of reality. But the fourth philosophy is called idealism. And idealism suggests that everything, the world, even your brain, neurons, everything in it is an appearance of consciousness. And this is very much in line with the Vedic philosophies, the non-duality in the East, that people have, you know, the spiritual view of the world that we've had for thousands and thousands of years. And I guess a good analogy would be if I shine light through raindrops in the atmosphere, then the raindrops split the light into a rainbow and you get red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And if all these colors were we people, then blue might shout across to violet, "Oh, hi, how you doing, Violet?" And she's, "Oh, I feel very in touch with myself." "How about you, yellow?" "I'm very bright and cheery." "Are you doing well today, blue?" "Oh, you know, I'm true to myself. I'm feeling really blue today." And all these colors would feel themselves to be separate, but they're not. They're really just appearances of the same white light that shone through the rainbow drop. So idealism argues that the world, the universe, all within it are appearances of the same light, the same consciousness. And we just feel ourselves to be separate, but we're not really, we're all really part of the same thing. So in the book, I argued that if it is true that the evidence in support of prayer that I've argued is to do with felt connection, and the evidence in support of psi, ESP and all that is true, then materialism must be wrong. And something like idealism or panpsychism or something in between must more likely be true. And so I argued that in the book. So that chapter was very tricky to write because academic philosophy, you know, you could read like 5 pages of Immanuel Kant and you're like, what are you talking about? You know, it's like, how about a chase scene every once in a while? You know, and it's just notoriously complex. And so it took me so long to keep coming back to that chapter and making it simpler and simpler and simpler until it could read like a novel kind of thing. It has to be easy because I want my books that my mum can read and my dad can read. You know, not overly academic
accessibility, aren't we? We're talking about your level of accessibility.
Yeah.
Because you know, as I listen to you, and as it stimulates and triggers impulses and thoughts and memories within me, it feels, and this, you know, this is something that I'm just responding to very instinctively, that being a medievalist, you know, having worked in the metaphysics of medievalism, particularly through Shakespeare's language and his contemporaries, and then going back into Leonardo da Vinci, that we're literally going full circle through the crown of the cerebrum. All of the intellect, we're actually going back to the interconnectivity of the universe that was believed of before the separation took place at the beginning of the 17th century, effectively in 1623, with Isaac Newton's rallying cry that then stimulated René Descartes. So, you know, we won't go into it now, but I'd love to have a conversation with you about that because prophetically, I feel that you're actually nudging us towards a really interesting area of study where we can begin to understand the interconnectivity of energy and how it's stimulated by feeling is the language of the soul.
Yeah. It's one of the...
It's what Raiden trying to do with his morphogenetic field, which he did excellently, you know, and in the 60s and early 70s, he brought forth that whole thesis about cell having memory and therefore creating more electrical fields that he called morphogenetics.
Yeah, I love Rupert Sheldrake's work.
Really. What's the next step, David? Because you're always boundless with this amazing energy of discovery and of the wonderful contribution that you make to our lives. And by the way, anybody, if you have questions, because our time is marching on, if you have questions, to ask of David, please write them in the chat box. And if you can be really precise, don't write a thesis, just write one simple sentence. What's the next step, David?
Do you know, I'm kind of formulating some ideas, but I feel drawn to write more on, you know, I believe that so I make no secret of the fact towards the end of the book, Why Woo-Woo Works, that I believe that either idealism is true, you know, non-duality, a single unified infinite consciousness is reality, and everything is we are meeting experiences of it. We are, you know, this is an appearance of consciousness. Each of us are like waves on an ocean, kind of thing. And I did suggest that is, maybe that's true. And even as a scientist, I would say that given the evidence, that's where I would find myself landing. I've always intuitively had a spiritual view of life anyway. And so I suggested that maybe one of the goals in life is just to be kind and show empathy and compassion for people. Because when we do that, we generate a felt connection, and it's the felt connection that we get that unites us with that which we are. What disconnects us from the sense of feeling connected to the infinity of consciousness is anger and judgment, and being unkind to people. But when we show infinite love and patience and compassion, then we naturally connect with each other. And that, I think, maybe that's why the great spiritual teachers have always said, the simplest, most powerful teaching, love one another. And so I argued that, and I even put a mathematical equation called the Enlightenment equation in the book, just as a joke, a bit of fun for anyone who's really interested in the more sciencey kind of stuff. I feel myself drawn to writing more on consciousness and, you know, maybe the infinity that we are. And I find whenever I write on a subject, Stuart, I feel myself, I get drawn more into it. Like in this book, I expanded, I would say, in my experience of consciousness, of the infinity, in terms of a sense of felt connection I personally feel in touch with. And at the same time, I pushed out into academic science in a way that I haven't before. Like in the writing of this book, I did 2 full years in mathematics and physics, studying the mathematics of relativity, Einstein's relativity, quantum mechanics, electromagnetism. So by doing all that and diving into the real hard mathematical sciences at the same, so I stretched in one direction. I found myself stretching equally in the spiritual direction, because I feel, Stuart, I feel part of my what I feel as a sense of purpose is as a translator. In the same way that someone might translate, you know, Spanish or French or Italian or Mandarin or something to people over here who don't understand the language, I feel that in stretching in both these directions, I can interpret the language of spirituality for scientists, but I can also interpret the language of science to people in the spiritual and healing arts. And I find I'm quite comfortable in the middle, where I can interpret, but I'm also very comfortable in the hard sciences, and I'm very comfortable in the felt spiritual experiences. So I found that naturally, I found myself stretching as I wrote the book, because I had to. There's no way I could have written it in the way that I did unless I stretched myself. So I feel that maybe my next stretch is going to pull me deeper into both sides. I feel myself drawn more into the consciousness, the infinity of the field as a felt experience, but at the same time, I feel my mathematical and scientific brain running and trying to say, how would I explain that to scientists? I would have to show a mathematical foundation of that to convince skeptics that maybe there's something in that kind of thing. So I don't know precisely what I'll do next in terms of writing, but I feel it's going to be something in that direction.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, you are making the unknowable knowable. and you're using your own specific lens,
Thank you.
which is, I mean, I feel that that's what I've just said has resonance and import. So, I would ask you to think about that. Janet is asking an interesting question here: is who or what is carrying out the most exciting scientific studies woo-woo at present? This is Janet Trelaw, who's a very extraordinary medium. Love this.
Hi there, Janet. Janet, I would say in terms of who, there's a lot of researchers really doing some great work, but I would say certainly one that I know more about his work is Dean Raiden, who is chief scientist at the Dean Raiden, who's chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I single him out in the sense that he has an appreciation of the woo-woo, in the sense that he's researched things like ESP and telepathy, but he brings real solid, not just academic science, but statistical science and a really high degree of knowledge and understanding of it. And so his most recent book, one of my all-time favorites, is called Real Magic. Wonderful book. And previous to that was Entangled Minds. And if you're looking for a summary of all of the research in that field of psi, then I would point you towards him. But equally, Rupert Sheldrake is always doing some amazing work. I love Rupert Sheldrake's work on telephone telepathy. When you've got to guess who is the person on the other end of the phone, and you've got to make one of four guesses, because there's one of four people could be phoning right now. Now, chance would say you should get it 25% of the time. But Sheldrake's research showed they got it 42% of the time, and that's way, way, way beyond statistical chance. So,
because I may just cut across you because our time is very short. Janet is a channel, and she's asking a question: is there any good research about channeling? She is actually, professional medium, and I believe that Lynn Twist and two of her friends, one of who is a channel, have just conducted scientific experiments around the whole substance of channeling in relation to the shift network. Is that true? Are you familiar?
I don't know enough to say factually whether I haven't. It's an area of research I didn't look into. Apologies for that. Only, I think that.
I mean, that is woo-woo.
Yeah.
This is the field of transcendentalism, which can be experienced, but not necessarily scientifically proven just yet.
Exactly.
This is going to be the next birthing within the field of science, isn't it?
Yeah, there was more stuff I wanted to research, but I couldn't find the space in the book. So I didn't even delve into the field. Apologies for not having a better answer than that, but it's only I just didn't have the time within the constraints of the book.
Yeah.
But
don't worry, we'll totally forgive you. Rome wasn't built in a day. Is it kindness or joy? This is Susanna, the last name is medium, so I presume you're a medium, my darling, are you? Is it kindness or joy, which is the higher frequency, please?
I would say kindness is something that you do and something that you feel, and joy is what is produced as a side effect. In terms of what is the higher in frequency, I honestly don't know. Because kindness, it's not quite as clear cut, because being kind, the act of kindness, generates a sense of felt connection. Now, part of that felt connection could be love. You could be being kind, and that could tap you into a feeling of love or connection for a person. So I don't know if it's quite as clear cut as saying kindness, simply because kindness taps into a feeling, which could be a variety. It could be based on empathy, compassion, love, or something like that. Joy is something that is produced as a consequence. So I honestly don't know what the answer to that would be, but that's a great question. Thank you.
Again, it's moving into the field of transcendentalism.
Yeah.
to throw a dime in, not as a point of obstruction, but as a point of amelioration. And one of the things that fascinates me is that at the moment I'm seeing hundreds and hundreds of people who are coming to me for a soul reading. And the majority of, we're in a post-COVID phase, and so we're beginning to see that COVID is not disappearing, but it's transmuting into another form, and eventually will become an endemic disease, as we know. It's probably as common as the common cold. Or influenza. So that's interesting. What has gotten us through? Well, of course, science has gotten us through in terms of the confessional of vaccination, which I'm writing about at the moment, but it's also to do with the great hope and the great joy and the great love that people have experienced, moving away from the trauma of social isolation into very, very deep meditative states and the use of prayer. We've got through. We're on the other side. That's remarkable, because a year ago we were being told that this was going to be an even greater disaster than it was. So I think that's rather intriguing. But the point that I wanted to make is that we're losing a feeling the vocabulary. We become so cerebralized that I discover when people come to me in duress, they don't know how to describe what they're feeling. They just say they're feeling like shit. And so what I do is I tease them into what they're really, really feeling. And we can begin to see that actually we're losing a feeling linguistic. Whereas if we go back, say, 400 years ago into medievalism, post-medievalism, all of the linguistic that they had, because it was non-literary, because only an eighth of the population could read, was based on the way that their bodies felt. So this is where we get the extraordinary fountain of Shakespeare's language. And of course, as we know, he actually fresh minted 2/3 of the English language. We're still using phrases. And they're all vowel-oriented words. Where we're engaged in vowel orientation, it's always to do with feeling. When we move into consonant, it's always to do with visualization. So that's one of the great fields of the way that I awaken the sensibility of feeling within the great actor. Actors are emotional gladiators. They have to be aware of feeling. Otherwise, what happens is they either become mawkish or untrue. So the audience stops watching. And part of my job for 40 years was to stimulate the whole substance of the great actor becoming mesmeric, so that the audience would be just glued to them. And as you and I talked, I think probably in Dublin Airport, I will never forget that evening when we were told that actually the flight was delayed by 3 hours. We sat down and we talked for 30 minutes, and then suddenly there was the flight, and it felt like 3 minutes.
I know, it was amazing.
Charisma. And I'm just writing another section for the book that was very successful, Diana, The Voice of Change. It's a 7,000-word prologue, which is going to be placed in it as a commemorative edition, because this year we celebrate 25 years of Diana's death. But her spirit is still with us. And so the last aspect of the prologue is all about charisma from an energetic point of view. Why did she have that? And what did she have that we want to acquire to assist the women of the world as they ignite their own radiance? As usual, this has been an amazing conversation. I thank you so much for coming on. And I'm sure you're now going to have all sorts of interesting dreams. Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I say thank you to Dr. David Hamilton. And he's there's his website. He's very easy to find. And of course, he is one of Hay House's leading authors. So whether you go to Amazon or Hay House, or indeed David's own website, you'll find a plethora of his writings wherever you go. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. It's been wonderful having you here. Lots of really fascinating comments, which I'll be looking into later. And sorry we didn't have any more time for questions, but we have been speaking for an hour over. In fact, it's 21:33, so we've been going. And, where has time gone? So thank you very much, David. If you can stay where you are. And I say to you all, namaste, namaste, namaste.
Thank you, everyone.